royal circles as Crawfie is not all it seems.
On the outskirts of Aberdeen, a shunned and lonely woman makes a suicide attempt. She has been rejected not by a lover or a relative, but by the family she had once loved as devotedly as if it were her own. The woman carried away to hospital was Marion Crawford. For 17 years, she was governess to the royal family, a second mother to the Queen. But she had become an outcast, unforgiven for a sensational act of betrayal against her employers. Marion Crawford was a working-class Scot. By a strange combination of chance and circumstance, she rose to become an intimate and trusted friend of the royal family at a time when their popularity was at an astonishing high.
Like everybody who's read your books, Miss Crawford, I think of you as Crawfie, but may I call you Crawfie?
Of course, please do. Everyone does. Princess Elizabeth first used the name many years ago. Now I'm known as Crawfie all over the world.
And I suppose outside the royal family itself, you know more about the real Elizabeth than anybody else.
Yes, perhaps I do. That little girl with golden curls, wrapped up in the eiderdown, looking over the window because it's rather higher than she is, looking at all the horses and the bands, and of course, when the Scottish pipes, the bagpipes appeared, it was a moment of great excitement.
In 1950, Crawfie published a sentimental, intimate account of her life with the Little Princesses. Wildly popular with the public in Britain and America, the royals hated it. Crawfie was pilloried as the family's Judas, the first palace insider to trade her privileged position to the press for personal profit. Her story marking the moment when palace gossip became a commodity, and the old system of discretion and trust finally fell apart. She was portrayed as the inventor of royal kiss and tell.
I mean, I think that the feeling of betrayal was very long-lasting in the royal family. One senior member of the royal household, very senior member of the royal household, said to me, she snaked. And I think that particular word, that suggestion of reptilian betrayal, sort of asp-like betrayal at the bosom of the royal bliss, summed up what was the continuing attitude of the royal family itself.
But has history treated Crawfie justly? New evidence suggests that Crawfie's articles were the result of a deliberate and secret attempt by the palace and the Foreign Office to manipulate public opinion and boost the standing of the royal family overseas. It now appears that Crawfie was encouraged to tell her story on official instructions. But when the PR exercise got out of control, it was she who became the scapegoat.
She was stitched up. I mean, none of her previous life had ever prepared her for anything like this. She was well prepared for her job as the royal governess. But when she moved into the media jungle, she'd no idea what it was like. It was too late by then.
Marion Crawford's own family life was shattered at the age of 2. With her parents, she'd emigrated to New Zealand, but after only 2 months, her father was killed in an industrial accident installing electric lines for the new tramways. With the breadwinner gone, the family returned to Scotland and a frugal Presbyterian life in Dunfermline. But education was taken seriously, and for a clever, diligent girl, this meant an escape route to Teacher Training College in Edinburgh.
She was a very serious, quiet student, and she lived in Dunfermline. So she would go straight home with other Dunfermline students in the train straight away. So she didn't take part in sport or extramural interests or even cups of tea in the college. She didn't stand out, you know, as a very amusing type.
But Murray House College in the 1920s was seething with radical new ideas in education, pioneering the disciplines of behavioural science and psychology. Marion Crawford was captivated.
Professor Godfrey Thompson, principal of Murray House, invented a lot of intelligence tests. He inspired us and encouraged us to realise that how much the environment, home, country, whatever it was, influenced the development of a child.
Her report card, 74, very good, put her among the top students, and she planned a career in child psychology, working with the poorest children of Edinburgh's slums. But in 1932, she got a temporary job with the grandest aristocratic family near her home, who decided that this working-class girl, brimming with modern ideas, would be a perfect summer governess for their children.
She came from Dunfermline to here, it was 3 miles. And so she'd come round the outside of the house because she knew the schoolroom was on the ground floor, tap on this window behind me and demand a cup of tea. So she was Cuppy from then on, and we'd hear tap tap on the window and here was Cuppy. We'd let her in through the door here.
Cuppy's 7-year-old charge was descended from the collector of the Parthenon marbles. At that time, many of them still cluttered the hallways of the house. The 22-year-old governess brought a new physical energy to the nursery.
Yes, I suppose it was all to do with this walking, and which I thought was very much life couldn't be led if you didn't have a good walk. And she thought that our life was not particularly vigorous, you see, and so therefore she pounced on me and see whether I was a flabby little, horrible little sort of slug-like thing. And I remember she pinching my thigh to make sure that there was something there.
One day that summer, Marion Crawford caught the eye of a visitor. She was looking for a governess for her 2 girls, and she would change Marion's life forever. Although no one knew it at the time, the elder of the 2 girls, Elizabeth, would one day be queen. One glance convinced the Queen Mother that Marion would be the ideal governess.
Well, she had a lovely spring in her step, and she looked vigorous, and she just was lively, and she couldn't fail to draw anybody's attention. I think she stood out, fresh and cheerful.
The Queen Mother was then Duchess of York, married to the shy brother of the glamorous Prince of Wales. A job in the York's household was simply too great an honour to be refused. And so Marion Crawford travelled to London and the townhouse in Piccadilly.
Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose spent some happy hours at the Royal Agricultural Hall, Islington, where they watched the children's classes with much interest.
She put aside her ambitions in psychology and adapted to her new life and her new nickname, Crawfie.
We were horrified when we heard that her name had been changed. She was Cuppy. We thought ours was much more appropriate.
In the articles she would publish after 17 years of service with the family, Crawfie revealed the only existing first-hand account of the isolated upbringing of the earnest Lilibet and willful Margaret in the nursery surrounded by Lilibet's 30 beloved toy horses.
One of Lilibet's favourite games that went on for years was to harness me with a pair of red reins that had bells on them, and off we would go delivering groceries. Sometimes she would whisper to me, "Crawfie, you must pretend to be impatient. Paw the ground a bit." So I would paw.
they just clicked. She had all the qualities the Queen Mother wanted in a governess. And when you think about it, she must have been so intimate. She had lunch with them, dinner with them, tea with them. She probably called the King Sir, I'm sure, and the Queen Mother Mom, but she must have forgotten at times. I mean, she was in the heart of the family, loved by them all, really loved. And the Queen Mother couldn't do without her.
Discretion, obedience and reserve. These qualities Crawfie seemed to have in abundance. But she still had a lively streak of independence. To the horror of the older courtiers, she took the girls out of the nursery, exploring in the wide world beyond.
The escalator to the underground seemed a perilous trip. Margaret's hand tightened on mine and she swallowed apprehensively. Once safely on, down we sailed and caught our train. Our jaunt was to the YWCA. We collected our own tea on trays with the rest of the clientele. Lilibet left her teapot behind. The lady in charge bawled out to her, "If you want it, you must come and fetch it." Tea out of thick cups, other people's bread and butter. Tea you paid for with money. These were rare treats. Only once were we beleaguered by the press. A persuasive young man recognized the children and wanted to take a picture. I knew that if this happened, it would be the end of our unofficial outings, so I drove him off mercilessly. "Crawfie, you were savage," Lilibet said delightedly. I am sure he now thinks that Crawfies bite.
She was really a very tough cookie, because even as an adult, and a mature adult, I found that I tended to toe the line with her. And I certainly wouldn't have liked my children to be, I'm sure she was an excellent governess, but she was very, very Presbyterian in her approach to things, I think.
It was the governess's job to ensure basic teaching, the educational side, the R's, the reading, writing, arithmetic, and then just general manners, the discipline of not always wanting everything, and how to remain reasonably sociable when you were in company and so on. If you were with the grown-ups, not to make a great scene about anything, just get on with it quietly.
(1936). Crawfie's peaceful life changed forever. The abdication of King Edward VIII to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson meant that Crawfie's employers were now king and queen. The family were propelled to Buckingham Palace under the gaze of the newsreel cameras. Now they were under constant scrutiny. The distant monarchy were becoming a very public royal family.
This is a picture of the King and Queen at home, enjoying the relaxations of that quiet family life, which is still, thank God, the background of our civilization.
Even a minor event, like the return from the Royal Tour of America in 1939, could generate an onslaught of public admiration.
As the carriage drives into the palace forecourt, a gust of wind steals Princess Elizabeth's hat.
As war threatened, the royal family were revered as the perfect image of a loving, typical family, symbols of the nation's identity. And Crawfie's role was becoming ever more vital.
Because of the war, these two royal children were evacuated to Windsor Castle. And who looked after them? Crawfie. There was nobody else to take her place fully, and she became more and more important.
1939, and the Queen decided that the princesses should stay at Windsor Castle. This is a beautiful castle. It's like a fairy fortress. And we felt so safe there within its thick walls. And really between the doodle bugs and the bombs, we had really quite a pleasant time at Windsor Castle.
Visiting tutors helped with French and history. But mostly, Princess Elizabeth, between the ages of 13 and 18, was educated by her governess in the rooms still known as the nursery unit.
Princess Elizabeth had an education which very much fitted in the pattern of the aristocracy of that period, in which female education was regarded not only as unnecessary but actually undesirable. The term blue stocking was much around. A little bit of French, perhaps a little bit of German, and ability to play the piano and draw nicely and have good deportment was about a limit of what was expected and required of them.
Yes?
It is curious that the three great queens of British post-medieval history, Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria and the present Queen, all of whom are highly intelligent women, of those three, the one who had the least academic, the least scholarly education is the most recent one.
The war years had done little for the princesses academically, but these newsreel glimpses of Elizabeth doing her bit for the war effort had made her even more of a celebrity. The royal family welcomed the positive publicity, but continued to guard their private lives with a code of absolute discretion and silence. The result was a hunger for information, any information, about what lay behind the palace doors. But what would persuade the family's most trusted confidant to divulge these secrets?
Well, I think this is the mystery of the century royal-wise. It's not only why did she do it, but who prompted her. My own view is that somebody persuaded her to do it, saying to her, and convincing her, which is even more extraordinary, that this would be wonderful for the public and wonderful for the royals. Common sense should have told her that it wasn't. But who was this person?
The chase was on for the governess's story. In 1947, Princess Elizabeth was heading southward with her family on HMS Vanguard for a tour of South Africa.
The princesses are here seen enjoying deck games in company with a number of midshipmen. And when I say enjoying, I mean just that.
She had with her a photograph of another dashing young naval officer who was waiting for her in England. His name was Prince Philip of Greece. As Elizabeth wrote excitedly to her governess to discuss her hopes for the future, Crawfie wrote back with the plans for her own wedding. For Crawfie had a secret sweetheart too.
Looking back, I don't think that Aunt May had a great deal of experience with men. She was pretty naive, I think. But he certainly swept her off her feet, and she was very, very much in love with him.
George Bathley had caught Crawfie's eye years before.
She was quite young, in her early 20s, when he asked her to marry him. And she didn't marry him. I don't know why she didn't marry him, but I would imagine it was because of the job.
He was great fun. He was very athletic and keen on music and dancing and tennis. He was very musical. He used to play the church organ at Adney Green in Aberdeenshire. He had a church choir, and he played the trumpet and had a dance band, I believe.
George Bathley had been a military man and then a bank manager in Scotland and Ceylon. He was a divorcee, 16 years older than Crawfie and more worldly.
He was banned from taking me to the City Hotel for when he went down for his aperitif before lunch, because I was too young to go into the bar. But forget about that. But he was fun.
Before the war, Crawfie had asked to be released from royal service, but she'd been told her departure would not be at all convenient.
She probably approached the Queen Mother, I don't know how many times, but certainly 4 times. And the Queen Mother said the same thing every time. "Oh, Crawfie dear, this isn't the right time. We can't possibly do without you."
Crawfie's wedding was a quiet affair in the Abbey in Dunfermline. The omens were not good. George Buffley had already irritated palace officials with his suggestion that the royal bank account should be moved from Cootes to Drummond's, the bank where he worked. But for Crawfie, her marriage seemed to reflect all the fairy tale glamour of the royal wedding, which would follow 2 months later. When Elizabeth married, the 38-year-old governess was finally released from royal service. With her husband, she slipped from the limelight to a rent-free Grace and Favour cottage behind Kensington Palace. Meanwhile, her former pupil reached new heights of fame as she and her husband took America by storm.
There was enormous, absolutely overwhelming fascination in the United States with the British royal family, comparable to the kind of lust for information that accompanied Princess Diana. And so after her marriage, Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh went to the United States. They were featured in a way beyond most glamorous Hollywood film stars. But the point was that it was a kind of democratic interest. There was interest in them as royalty, but they were kind of Americanized in the process. And, you know, she was referred to as Liz and all that sort of thing.
For 800 correspondents, this is a chance to meet America's guests at close range. But it's quite an ordeal for the princess to face the close-up inspection of 800 professional writers. Even a prince must sometimes wonder what they're writing about him.
In America, the press were not restrained by protocol and tradition. Bruce and Beatrice Gould published the Ladies' Home Journal, America's best-selling woman's magazine, and they badly wanted a story about Elizabeth, the biggest celebrity of the day. But all their approaches had run into the palace wall of silence.
From their circulation point of view, they wanted to run the story of the princesses. They started at the palace, but the palace weren't keen. And then someone had the good idea of thinking about the Foreign Office, and it moved on from there.
At the time, the Foreign Office was desperately searching for schemes to improve cooperation with the United States and raise Britain's profile there. They thought a story publicising the little princesses was perfect. And so, in a piece of groundbreaking transatlantic PR, the American press barons were given access to the palace. Now they needed to appoint a writer who would win the confidence of the royal family. Dermot Morra fitted the bill, a dry and formal journalist who had written speeches for the king. But the Goulds knew that Morra's forelock-tugging prose alone wouldn't be enough for America. He'd need a source at the heart of the palace, a real insider. The Foreign Office joined the chase.
None of the courtiers at the palace wanted to write the story, not unnaturally, and nobody at the Foreign Office felt that they knew the little princesses, and somebody there had the bright idea that the royal governess would be the ideal one. So she was asked to write the story. No question of her hawking her secrets around to make cash for herself or anything like that. She was asked to undertake it officially.
The Queen Mother wanted the articles to go ahead, but she also wanted to preserve the family code of secrecy and silence. The letter she sent to Crawfie was to trigger a dramatic chain of events that would destroy the culture of discreet press deference to royalty forever. The letter gave Crawfie the green light to tell her story. There would be a cash reward, but Crawfie herself was instructed to remain firmly in the shadows.
Mr. Morra, who I saw the other day, seemed to think that you could help him with his articles and get paid for it in America. This would be quite all right, as long as your name did not come into it, as people in positions of confidence with us must be utterly oyster.
The Goulds set about prizing the oyster open. They began a charm offensive to persuade Crawfie to write a memoir of her own. At first, Crawfie insisted she would not put her name to the story. She was used to obeying royal instructions unquestioningly. Yet now she was upset. Sidelined with a meagre pension in her little cottage, she felt her central role in the princesses' lives was going to be denied. She was to be airbrushed from the picture. And the Goulds knew what would win over Crawfie's husband: money. In this newly discovered tape, they revealed just how much they were prepared to pay.
I said I would pay them, I think was it $85,000?
About that.
Which is a big hunk of money, and more than she would ever have in her life.
Tempted by dollars, and soothed and encouraged by her husband and her publisher, Crawfie's stance shifted. What if she were to write the story, and if it were then shown to the Queen Mother? Surely, once she had read it, she would give it her blessing. A tangled contract agreement was drawn up. It contained the reassuring words, "If your manuscript seems the ideal one, we shall both exert every effort to persuade the Queen to publication." But further down it contained a more ominous clause. "You will consider publication of the articles under your own name without Her Majesty's consent." Did Crawfie not know what she'd agreed to?
George Butley was a bank manager. And that rather sort of speaks for itself. I mean, he was interested, he would see to the contract and that sort of thing. She'd no experience of anything like that. She'd led a very, very sheltered life. So he would say, "My dear, I'll see to the contract." She was stitched up between two very astute men, both of whom were using her to bring the money in. It's so incredible for her to have been placed in this position, and the sort of words that would be used when they were speaking about the contract and that kind of thing would all seem quite all right, you know, till it was signed.
Through the summer of 1949, in a hotel opposite Kensington Palace, Crawfie told her life story to a ghostwriter, a popular romantic novelist of the time, Dorothy Black. Once the manuscript was in their office in America, the Goulds could publish Crawfie's story whether or not the royal family agreed. Chapter by chapter, it was spirited to the States.
We were a little bit worried about this thing because you never know what the powers of the royalty are, and so we began to, when we got this, we would then airmail it back to the United States because we didn't want...
Keeping one copy.
Yeah, we didn't want the thing suddenly seized, and you know, and so we were getting it out of the country as fast as we could.
With their friend Lady Astor as the go-between, the Goulds had the finished manuscript delivered to the Queen Mother. Her response was a handwritten note, the spelling mistakes betraying its haste and the extent of her fury.
This development has made us very sad. The whole thing has been a great shock to us, and we can only think that our late and completely trusted governess has gone off her head.
Crawfie waited, desperate to know how her work had been received. Gould was determined to keep her in the dark about the palace's rage, as he swiftly prepared to have the articles published. The Queen, he told her, seems a little miffed. Christmas 1949, the presses of the Ladies' Home Journal in America geared up for the first episode of their sensational serialization. Meanwhile, through the curious semaphore of palace protocol, Crawfie received a decisive signal that she was being frozen out. She wrote,
"We had a Christmas card from Malta from Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, but for the first time in my life, I have not received one from the King and Queen."
Visitors reported Crawfie was near to a nervous breakdown. She faced the worst possible outcome. Her work had not won over the Queen Mother, quite the reverse, and yet she was now powerless to prevent its publication. As the enormity of what she had done began to dawn on her, her panic became shrill. She insisted that although her name had been on the manuscript, she had been told, ordered to tell her story, and had simply obeyed. In her letters to the Goulds, her husband George Butley's irate tones became increasingly audible.
"If the Queen decides to be unfriendly, or worse, she will be the loser. If an attempt should be made to eject me from this house, I shall fight in court and have the facts made public, if I'm driven to do so.
But Crawfie was about to be sold for a second time. In Britain, Woman's Own were launching colour printing. As soon as they learned of the Gould scoop, they recognised that for circulation, Crawfie was dynamite. The magazine snapped up Empire serialisation rights for £30,000, a sum so unprecedented that questions were asked in Parliament about whether it was even legal. The discreet transatlantic PR exercise had snowballed into a front-page sensation. On both sides of the Atlantic, the success of The Little Princesses was phenomenal. The articles became a book. The book became a bestseller.
The life, the royal family, their life, that is the king, the queen and the two children, was sacrosanct. Not a, you didn't say that the king took 2 spoonfuls of sugar, the queen mother wore a nightdress. Nothing, absolutely nothing. It was secret, secret, and she broke the trust.
By modern standards, the book seems fawning. Yet in 1950, the chatty disclosures about the king's moodiness and Princess Margaret's indiscipline, Lilibet's teenage crushes and the Queen Mother's chilly relations with Mrs. Simpson were all shockingly frank.
Of the 2 children, Lilibet was the one with the temper, but it was under control. Margaret would often defy me with a sidelong look, make a scene and kiss and be friends and all forgiven and forgotten.
And although they're often dismissed as woman's magazine saccharine, Crawfie's observations have the stamp of authenticity, a unique private record of the childhood of the present queen.
At one time I got quite anxious about Lilibet and her fads. She became almost too methodical and tidy. She would hop out of bed several times a night to get her shoes quite straight, her clothes arranged just so. One day there were curious sounds in the schoolroom. Lilibet, rebelling all of a sudden and goaded by boredom to violent measures, picked up the big ornamental silver ink pot and placed it without any warning upside down on her head. She sat there with ink trickling down her face and slowly dyeing her golden curls blue.
In America, a marketing survey was conducted to gauge the impact of the serialization of The Little Princesses. It had significantly improved the public perception of Great Britain and greatly boosted the popularity of the royal family. The publishers who'd contrived to get Crawfie to write her story were invited to tea with the royal family at St. James's Palace. Meanwhile, Crawfie and her husband quietly packed their bags and left the Grace and Favour House at Kensington Palace, where the royal family's silent disapproval had become too much to bear. Crawfie's betrayal had been personal. However positive the consequences, she would not be forgiven. This television documentary about Elizabeth, shown in Canada in 1953, contains the only existing interview with Crawfie. It has never before been seen in Britain.
The Duke and Duchess of York, then her parents, gave me full responsibility. And you can imagine how very greatly I felt responsibility. But she was such a charming child. She was gay, and she was very serious-minded through it all. And one almost felt then that she had a very strong, shall I say, strong premonition of the great position that she was going to fill in later life.
But the BBC considered the presence of Crawfie too provocative to broadcast. When the programme was shown in Britain, the section containing Crawfie was cut out. And the royal family, too, cut Crawfie out. For her, there could be no rehabilitation. Though she did not know it then, Marion Crawford's journey into the wilderness was only beginning. In the early 1950s, Crawfie had become a sales phenomenon. And now they had their golden goose, the publishers wanted her to keep laying lucrative royal eggs. Crawfie herself saw no alternative to a continued career in journalism. She wrote to Bruce Gould,
I shall certainly require every penny I can earn if the Queen's displeasure is brought to bear against me.
And so her husband signed her up on contract to Nunes, publisher of Woman's Own.
She continued to be a saleable commodity in the women's press, and she continued to write on a fairly frequent basis, and indeed to produce a number of books which got thinner and thinner as her distance from royalty increased and she had less and less to say.
And soon, Crawfie's sentimental outpourings had a whole column in Woman's Own.
Which of us failed to whisper a little prayer when she left? Now her 6-month absence has brought her even closer to our hearts.
The editorial staff at the magazine had found that Crawfie's column could easily be produced without the time-consuming process of actually getting Crawfie to write it.
Oh, no, she never wrote a word of it, no. But that again was, pretty frightful for her. I don't suppose she knew that in advance either. No, someone in the features department in Woman's Own did it. Different people did it. And I mean, really, it was any sort of social chit-chat. But they tried always to give it a royal flavour. As if she was at all these functions, whereas in fact she was sitting in a nice house in Aberdeen.
In 1955, the colour printing technology that had made Crawfie's articles so popular was to bring about her downfall.
Oh, well, it was quite dreadful. I was there, and I do remember it all very well indeed. Because of the huge circulation, it had to go to press. The magazine had to go to press 6 weeks in advance. So frequently the writing was slanted to that effect. And the Trooping the Colour was coming up in June. And there was a young man from Canada called Steve, and he was currently writing Crawfie's column. So he prepared his piece, and he described how magnificent the Queen looked on her horse, and what a huge success Trooping the Colour was, and everything was wonderful.
At the great London stations, all is still.
And the only terrible part was that on that particular day there was a train strike, and the Trooping the Colour was cancelled, but not in Woman's Own. There was the Queen on her horse. Well, how did you explain this away?
The Trooping the Colour ceremony and Royal Ascot, both lovingly described in Crawfie's column, had failed to happen.
All hell broke loose because, not unnaturally, all the competitors seized their moment. They knew fine that Crawfie's column was written in the office and all the rest of it. So the phones never stopped ringing, the management were driven crazy. There was a siege at Crawfie's home in Aberdeen, and Woman's Own was exposed as, a sort of sham had been going on. Well, Steve was to be sacked, the editor was to be sacked, everybody was to be sacked. It was a most dreadful event. But in the end, in fact, it all blew over.
It all blew over for everyone except Crawfie. Her name had appeared on the articles, and it was she who was merrily ridiculed by rival newspapers.
The skill with which she has so profitably remembered the past has not been so successful when she's peered into the future.
Royal Ascot, maybe she'd care to give us the winner. Might come in handy in July.
The Crawfie column, needless to say, disappeared, but it couldn't disappear for 6 weeks. Because the reason I've explained, it had to go to press so early. So it ran on for the 6 weeks, but it was phased out, I can tell you, pretty quickly. And that was the end of Crawfie. And it was really tragic.
Marion and George Bathley settled into a quiet retirement. With the money they'd earned from publication of The Little Princesses, they bought a house on the prosperous fringes of Aberdeen. With them came the ghosts from the past.
When you went to see her, she would probably come out and she would greet you. And she would shake you by the hand, but it wasn't a handshake. It was a royal, you took her fingers, you felt you should bow and kiss the back of her hand. I mean, to give you an example of the odd sort of relationship, George Butler in his army career, obviously absorbed thousands of jokes, barrackroom humour, which really I would have sort of shuddered to repeat, certainly in ladies' company. He would crack a couple of jokes every time I went, and they were always different. And she would sit perched on the edge of a dining room chair, very prim, her hands in her lap and her feet tucked under her, and her face was completely blank.
She never discussed the royal family at all. She felt that she had got a very bad press, and she just didn't want to have the whole thing dragged up again, because it had obviously become very painful for her.
The house that the couple had chosen for themselves had a commanding view of the main road from Aberdeen to Royal Deeside, where the royal family went on holiday each year.
The royal family would travel out and back and forward to Balmoral along this road, which was no more than, 200 yards from our house. She probably had a hope somewhere behind somewhere that perhaps as the girls matured, they would throw off the royal veto and at least contact her. As far as I know, it didn't happen. And there she was, having the princesses passing her door. I mean, it must have been heart-rending for her.
I think there's a bit of an enigma, because of course there always is the story associated with her about the writing of the books and breach of confidence, and you know, whatever were the rights and the wrongs and the ins and outs of that, for somebody who was apparently disloyal, she was actually remarkably discreet, and I think she was extremely loyal, particularly to the Queen and to Princess Margaret.
The royal family and Crawfie both understood the unwritten rules and obeyed them. Once Crawfie had been ostracised, there could be no going back, and that simply had to be accepted. As with any family separation, there was shattering heartbreak for both sides.
How do they look back on their childhood? They must have got very happy memories, but do they sort of block them out? Can you imagine somebody brought you up as a child? You don't even send them a box of chocolates or a card in an envelope, you know, secretly written kind of thing. Nothing. So it shows you, it reveals a facet of the character of that royal family that is a bit frightening at times, isn't it?
There was one lady in waiting who said to me that when she arrived at the palace a few years later, she was told, in dealing with correspondence, if a letter came from Marion Crawford, it was to be handled with a very long pair of forceps.
Peter Fleming was actually at a meal with the Queen, and the Queen was talking, and he thought he heard her refer to Crawfie. So he perked up and said, "Oh, ma'am, how is she?" But the Queen had been referring to Porchy, the short name for her stud manager, Lord Porchester, not to Crawfie at all. So answer came there none. The whole thing dropped dead like a stone. Silence. Well, he realised he'd made a terrific gaffe.
I think the royal family are fairly unforgiving. And it is run like the army. Everybody knows their place and acts accordingly. And if you step out of line, well, there's a court-martial and that's it. They don't say, "Would you like to come back?"
After Crawfie, all palace employees would have to sign an official non-disclosure clause to guarantee their silence. The royal family could never have the same unguarded intimacy with a servant again. In Aberdeen, the last foundations of Marion Crawford's stability were about to be undermined.
I was now about 16, and that is when troubles really started with George Buckley and myself. He was giving me too much attention. I was going to be his little amusement, I suppose, and I didn't know what to do about it. So I wrote her a letter and told her about it. And I never saw her again. She didn't believe me. I don't think she believed me, or if she did, she didn't want to believe me, one or the other.
The claim that George had been taking advantage of her young niece was shocking for Crawfie, but she chose to stand by her husband. He protected me, she later wrote in an impassioned letter to a neighbour. When George died in 1977, Crawfie retreated further into a solitary world of memories.
She had a box in which she kept various mementos. I suppose the sort of things that you would expect, Christmas cards from various members of the royal household, particularly from the Queen, Princess Margaret. Papers, copy letters, more of a legal type documents. These were obviously important things to her. They were precious things that anyone would have valued, and I think she simply kept them together and kept them with her.
She kept the treasured correspondence not just out of affection, but in the hope that one day the world would learn that she had been pushed and prompted to trade the family's confidences. She may have been greedy and naive, with a false sense of her own security at the heart of the royal family. But Crawfie felt she had been left to shoulder all the blame for a disaster that was only partly of her own making. Crawfie's true legacy was as the first casualty of the fierce, destructive love-hate relationship between the royals and the media that would so dominate the story of the monarchy in the modern age.
A policewoman called at our door, and I think she had been alerted by the postman, who suspected something unusual had happened. When we got into the house, she was in bed looking pretty ghastly. She had attempted an overdose. It was very sad. We felt that it was really just a cri de coeur.
The emergency services who attended to Crawfie recall a note by her bedside. "The world has passed me by, and I cannot bear those I love to pass me by on the road." Although Crawfie recovered from her overdose attempt, her health was failing. She died in Aberdeen in 1988. Crawfie's funeral was not well attended. No representative from the palace was present, and there was no wreath from the royal family.
With age comes wisdom, we're told, but does it also create prejudice? Tackling ageism and discrimination in Working with Dinosaurs next Tuesday at 8 o'clock. Next tonight, the guns are loaded for a shooting party at the Edwardian Country House.